The things we do for love. Think about it. What have you done in the hope of being loved and cared for? Some may remember silly and somewhat embarrassing episodes like texting an ex in the middle of the night or pretending to like Gilmore Girls. Or perhaps you go through very painful and humiliating situations where you didn't set your limits or express your needs and feelings because you were afraid of being rejected. Patterns we see in dysfunctional relationships. In my work as a clinical psychologist, I witness daily how far people will go for love, even if the relationship is directly harmful to them. We call these emotionally abusive relationships, and it has been a previously overlooked field within psychology, but also in society and among the population. Although emotional abuse is illegal by law in Denmark and Great Britain, there is no clear definition, and it is very difficult to prove in a lawsuit. Think about it. How do you prove a crime that leaves no physical marks and the only witness is the victim? Emotional abuse is characterized by a systematic, persisting and demeaning, scornful, devaluing, humiliating behavior from your partner. A partner that controls all your social life, financial decision, and manipulate and pressures you emotionally. Such a partner can be very jealous and demand to know where the woman is at all time. Yes, women are subjected to this type of violence 3.5 times as often as men in Denmark, which is why I will say she while talking about this subject. Perhaps she's constantly told how stupid, ugly, and incompetent she is. But it can also be much more subtle. And then she's manipulated by statements like, "You're too sensitive. You misunderstood. Or you're wrong." The consequences are often high level of stress, anxiety, and depressions, and even PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So, you might ask, how on earth could a person ever have misinterpreted this kind of relationship for love? How could they ever have come to the conclusion that they were not worthy of love and should be grateful for this kind of abuse? In my opinion, the attachment style theory offers the best explanation. And let me explain by telling you a story. It's the story about a little girl who grew up in an ordinary family with a father, mother, and a brother. They lived in a nice area, in a nice house, and the parents were well educated. But it's also a story about a mother who was mentally ill and who got admitted several times throughout the little girl's childhood. She suffered from anxiety, depressions, and later it turned out that she had personality disorders. So, the father was the primary caretaker in periods. He was ambitious, worked a lot, and he took care of the children's physical needs, but emotionally, he was incompetent. At times, he would demean and ridicule his children for showing emotions or not being good enough. So the little girl grew up with a mix of admiration and anxiety towards her father. When the girl was 5 years old, the mother was in a very bad traffic accident and she got hospitalized. The little girl, she was afraid that it was not just an accident and she couldn't shake the thought that she might have done it on purpose. So when the father shortly after decided to get a divorce, the little girl could not leave her mother and she stayed with her. So, at the age of 5, this little girl was already overly responsible, willing to set aside her own needs, blaming herself for her parents' bad mood. Sometimes the parents showed her affection and told her that they loved her. But for this girl, love was uncertain, and she grew up with a feeling of being unworthy of love, wrong and ugly. Attachment style theory says that this little girl will very likely repeat this pattern in her adult relationship, setting her own needs aside, blaming herself for her partner's bad mood, and feeling grateful for any kind of love, even if it comes with abuse. Because love is uncertain, and for this girl, it becomes a repeatedly pattern. But on the other hand, we see children that are securely attached. They will grow up being independent and confident adults with high self-esteem and the ability to create a loving and caring relationship. So, how widespread is this phenomenon? Let's say that there's around 250 women in this room and the same number of men. Then 63 of the women and 33 of the men will have experienced this kind of unhealthy relationship, and some of them will still be in it. You may object and say that this kind of neglect is not particularly widespread, and that it only occurs in the lower classes of society. Well, in high-income countries like Denmark, between 35% and 40% of the population is unsecure attached, and it has nothing to do with social status. You can have a big, nice house, food on the table, and no emotional contact with your parents. So it is a considerable problem, not just for the individual, but also for society. Because we know that attachment style is passed on to the next generation, and we know that they're stable through life. The good news is that you can change an insecure in a more secure direction, and not all insecure attached ends up in a psychologically abusive relationship. In my work, I mostly work with women who have been or still are in these type of relationships, and I have seen some common themes. Themes that these women have learned throughout their upbringing, and they become part of their relationships. These women are often very good at seeing and meeting other people's needs and wants, but very poor of taking care of themselves. They often have difficulties with setting and maintaining their personal boundaries. And these women also have a tendency to internalize, which means that they look for explanations within themselves when something fails or does not succeed, especially in their relationships. They often have a very critical inner voice, an inner voice that is reinforced in the abusive relationship. And these women often live in the illusion of what the relationship or man could be, rather than relate to what is actually going on. And then they often have a deep feeling of loneliness, abandonment, and sadness. And it's these feelings that they try to avoid in the attempt to save the relationship or perhaps the partner. I truly feel that a loving and caring relationship is fundamental to a meaningful life. But some of us has a very bad starting point. I want to change that. In my work, I help clients examine and understand their attachment style, so they can become aware of old beliefs and patterns of action. I find that insight and awareness is the key to help these women to change. When they start to understand the relationship and how they themselves fitted into this destructive dance. Let's say you have a deep fear of being abandoned, then setting boundaries is an almost impossible act. But when you can accept and understand your own survival strategies, then it becomes possible for you to do something today that might be better. Accepting can be painful because it forces you to see the reality of your own avoidance and relate to the reality of the abusive relationship. I asked you in the beginning what you were willing to do for love. And for many, it's a relevant question. Will you listen with respect even though you don't agree? Will you try to understand your partner's feelings and motives even though it feels like they just want to annoy you? Will you show affection through lots of hugs and kisses and back off when your partner needs space? But sometimes you also need to ask yourself, what am I not willing to do for love? I will not let another person call me names, and I will not let people treat me disrespectfully, and I will not let people threaten me, because sometimes you need to say no to others and break the old pattern and say yes to yourself. Thank you.